Imagine discovering a son you never knew existed, a son whose life now depends on you. When Jake, a successful businessman, finds Emma sobbing on his doorstep, he learns he's not only a father but that his son, Michael, urgently needs a liver transplant. Thrown into a world of unexpected responsibility and bound by the weight of years lost, Jake steps into a battle against time, filled with struggles, heartache, and a connection he's never felt before. This story of redemption, resilience, and hard-fought love will take you on an emotional journey, revealing the strength of family bonds against all odds. Be sure to watch until the end, and if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay connected with more impactful stories. The morning sun was barely up when Jake Dawson's phone buzzed on his office desk. He glanced at it, momentarily distracted from the neatly organized files awaiting his attention. The early riser, a man devoted to his business, always made sure to be in his office at dawn, ensuring no deal went unnoticed, no opportunity overlooked. The polished walnut desk, the faint aroma of rich coffee in his sleek black mug, and the crisp hum of the air conditioning were his companions in the sanctuary of success he'd built. But this morning, something felt out of place. His phone buzzed again. Unknown caller. He let it go. Probably another solicitor. Jake resumed his work, but then, a gentle knock on the door, unusual this early, pulled his gaze from the papers. "Mr. Dawson?" His assistant, Mara, called softly, peeking in. "There's someone outside. She seems, distressed." Jake looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Distressed?" "Yes. She didn't want to give her name, but she asked specifically for you and said it's urgent." A sense of unease stirred within him. Jake was used to confrontations in business, but he couldn't recall any personal grievances serious enough to bring someone to his office unannounced. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Fine. Show her in." A few moments later, a young woman stepped into his office. Her face, framed by soft curls and eyes glistening with unshed tears, held an intense look of both fear and determination. She wore a simple, weathered coat, contrasting starkly with the sleek modern decor around her. She was trembling slightly, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Dawson? Jake?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Yes," he replied, surprised by the familiarity. "And you are?" She took a deep breath, as if mustering the courage for something monumental. "My name is Emma Fields." She hesitated, her gaze faltering for a moment. "I'm the mother of your son, Michael." Jake felt the air leave his lungs. The silence in the room grew thicker. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "My son?" Emma's lips pressed together as she nodded, her voice steady but filled with pain. "Yes, I've carried this secret for a long time, Jake, but I had no choice but to come to you now." Jake's mind raced, memories flashing back to years he had spent chasing success, pushing relationships and regrets to the background. But why now? Why, after all these years? Her eyes met his, brimming with a mother's desperation. "Because he needs you, Jake," she said, her voice breaking. "Michael needs a liver transplant, and he needs it urgently." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. A son, his son, and he was sick? He stumbled back, his polished businessman's composure slipping. Why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice was barely a whisper. Emma took a steadying breath, her face etched with sorrow and a tinge of regret. "Because, back then, you had a life you were building. I knew you wanted to go far, and I couldn't disrupt that for you." Jake shook his head, trying to process this torrent of emotions. "Emma, you had no right to decide that for me. He's my son too." Her eyes flickered with a mix of defiance and remorse. "Maybe I was wrong, but I did what I thought was best at the time. Michael is my world. I protected him as best I could, but now—" Her voice cracked, and her hand went to her mouth, stifling a sob. Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing. Where is he now?" "St. John's Hospital," she replied quietly, looking down. "They're running tests, preparing for the transplant if they find a match. The doctors told me family is the best chance. I had to come to you." A long silence settled between them. Jake's gaze lingered on the faint smudges of dirt on her coat, a stark reminder of the battles she'd fought alone. He was torn, guilt and confusion gnawing at him. A son, a child he'd never known, lying in a hospital, possibly fading. "I want to meet him," Jake said, finally finding his voice. Emma's eyes softened, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Jake. He deserves to know you." The two of them walked out together, the silence thick but somehow comforting. In the quiet moments between them, Jake's thoughts churned with the weight of questions. His son. What kind of person was he? Would he resent him? Could they truly bond after so many years lost? The hospital was cold, its sterile air filled with the low hum of machines and whispered conversations. Emma led the way, her steps quick and purposeful. When they reached the door to Michael's room, she paused, glancing back at Jake. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and fear. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. He was about to meet a part of himself he had never known existed. As they entered, he saw a young man lying on the bed, his skin pale and his eyes closed. Tubes ran from his arm to a machine beside him, monitoring his vitals. He looked fragile, but there was a quiet strength in his face that reminded Jake of his younger self. Emma gently touched Michael's shoulder, her voice soft. "Michael, sweetheart, someone's here to see you." Michael's eyes fluttered open, and he looked at his mother, then at Jake. There was a flicker of confusion, then curiosity, as he studied the man beside his mother. "Michael," Emma began, her voice steady but emotional. This is your father." Michael's gaze shifted from Emma to Jake, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Jake feared rejection, a refusal to acknowledge him. But instead, Michael gave a slight nod, as if accepting this stranger into his world, even if cautiously. Jake cleared his throat, attempting a smile. "Hi, Michael. I'm Jake." Michael looked at him, his voice quiet but steady. "I've heard about you. Mom told me some things." Jake glanced at Emma, who gave a small, reassuring nod. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude toward her for this moment, despite everything. "I know this is sudden, Michael. I don't expect anything from you, but I'd like to be here for you." A silence stretched between them before Michael replied, "That's all I want. Someone who will be here." Jake swallowed, fighting the surge of emotions that rose within him. "Then I will. I promise." The tension dissolved slightly, replaced by a fragile connection, the beginning of something neither had expected but both desperately needed. The silent promise between them marked a new chapter, one Jake intended to face with everything he had. Before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is how you can contribute and help us continue bringing meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep going. The hospital room felt both cold and quiet, a stark contrast to the emotional storm brewing within Jake. He sat beside Michael's bed, watching as the young man rested, his breathing steady, each rise and fall of his chest somehow grounding the father he barely knew. The rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the silence, a strange comfort in an otherwise overwhelming situation. Michael stirred, opening his eyes slowly. Jake straightened, forcing a smile. "Hey there," he said gently. Michael blinked, his expression still guarded. "You're still here." Jake chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I'm not going anywhere." He cleared his throat. "I thought, maybe we could talk, if you're up for it." Michael shrugged, the guarded look never leaving his face. "Sure, I guess." Jake shifted in his seat, searching for the right words. "So, your mom told me a bit about you. But, I'd love to hear more from you. Anything, really. Whatever you want to share." Michael hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "Well, there's not much to say." His voice was quiet, almost dismissive. "I mean, I like music, basketball, sometimes, and I draw. A little." Jake's face softened with interest. "You draw? That's amazing. What kind of stuff do you like to draw?" Michael looked away, his tone cautious. "Mostly sketches, sometimes people, sometimes places. Just Whatever comes to mind. Jake smiled, trying to ease the tension. I'd love to see some of your work sometime. I bet it's really good. Michael's gaze flickered toward him, a hint of disbelief in his eyes. You don't have to pretend you care, you know, he murmured. We don't really know each other. The words hit Jake harder than he expected, and he took a moment to gather his thoughts. You're right, he admitted quietly. I don't know you yet, but I want to. More than anything, Michael's gaze softened, but his expression remained guarded. It's just hard to believe. All this time, I thought you didn't want to know me. Jake swallowed, his voice thick with regret. I'm so sorry, Michael. I never even knew about you. If I had, things would have been different. Michael looked down, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe. The door opened, breaking the tension, and a nurse entered, carrying a tray of medication. Good afternoon, Michael. Time for your meds, she said cheerfully, setting the tray on the table beside him. She glanced at Jake, her smile polite but curious. Are you family? Jake hesitated, glancing at Michael. Yes, I'm his father. The nurse's smile widened slightly. Well, it's nice to meet you, Mr. Dawson. Michael's a brave young man. He's been handling all of this really well. Michael looked away, a hint of bitterness in his expression. Not like I have a choice, he muttered. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You're doing great, Michael. Keep it up. She left the room, leaving father and son in silence once more. Jake reached for the water pitcher, pouring a glass and handing it to Michael. Here, for your meds. Michael took the glass, his gaze flicking up to meet Jake's briefly. Thanks. Jake's voice was soft. I'm serious, Michael. I want to be here for you. Whatever you need, just let me know, okay? Michael's fingers tightened around the glass, his expression conflicted. I don't need anything from you. Jake's heart sank, but he nodded, respecting the young man's guardedness. I understand, but if that changes, I'm here. As the silence settled over them again, Michael turned away, his voice low. It's weird, you know? All these years, I thought about what it would be like to have a dad. And now you're here and it's not what I thought it would be. Jake's voice trembled with vulnerability. I know, I can't change the past, Michael, but if there's a way I can make up for it, I'll do whatever it takes. Michael remained quiet, his gaze distant. We'll see, I guess. A gentle knock on the door interrupted their moment, and Emma stepped in, her face brightening slightly at the sight of Jake. How's it going in here? She asked, her voice warm but cautious. Jake looked up, managing a small smile. We're getting there, I think. Emma nodded, moving to Michael's bedside and smoothing his blanket. I'm glad. It's good for both of you. She glanced at Michael, a mother's love and worry in her eyes. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Michael shrugged, his tone casual but tinged with fatigue. Tired, but okay, I guess. Emma brushed a hand over his forehead, her touch gentle. You're doing amazing, honey. Just hang in there. Jake watched the tender exchange, a pang of regret and longing in his chest. He could see the bond they shared, one he had missed out on for so many years. Emma, he said softly, thank you for raising him, for being there. Emma looked at him, her gaze softening. He's a good kid, Jake. He deserves to have both his parents. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between them. You guys don't have to make this a big deal. Jake chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. Fair enough. No big deal. Just a father meeting his son for the first time after 20 years. Totally normal, right? Michael smirked, a faint spark of humor in his eyes. Yeah, totally. Emma smiled, the tension in the room easing slightly. See? You're both already getting along. Jake's heart lifted, a glimmer of hope piercing through his uncertainty. We'll figure this out, Michael. One step at a time. Michael looked at him, his gaze searching, as if trying to gauge the sincerity in his father's words. Finally, he nodded, a reluctant but meaningful gesture. As they sat together, the hum of the hospital faded into the background, and for the first time, Jake felt like he belonged in that room with his son. The days that followed were a delicate balance of anticipation and silence, filled with brief, cautious exchanges between Jake and Michael. Their conversations felt like walking on thin ice, each word carefully chosen, each sentence weighed down by the years they'd missed. Jake wanted so desperately to be close to Michael, but his son's walls were high, built on nearly 2 decades of absence. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Jake arrived at the hospital with a small sketchbook and a set of pencils wrapped in a ribbon. He entered Michael's room, where Michael was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Hey," Jake greeted, lifting the gift slightly. I got something for you." Michael turned, eyeing the gift warily. "What is it?" Jake hesitated, offering a small smile. "A sketchbook and some pencils. I remember you said you like to draw. Thought you might, want something to do while you're stuck here." Michael took the sketchbook, his fingers tracing the edges of the cover. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, I guess." Jake cleared his throat, sensing the hesitancy. "I know it's not much, but I just wanted to do something for you." Michael glanced down, then back at Jake, his voice low. "Look, I appreciate it, but you can't just come in here and pretend everything's normal. You're a stranger to me." Jake's face fell, the words hitting him harder than he expected. "I understand that, Michael. I do. But I'm trying." "Trying to what?" Michael's voice was sharper now, cutting through the room like a blade. "Make up for lost time? You can't just erase the fact that you weren't there." A tense silence settled between them, the air thick with resentment. Jake ran a hand over his face, struggling to find the right words. "I'm not trying to erase anything. I want to be here now." Michael looked away, his jaw clenched. "It's too late for that." Before Jake could respond, Emma entered, her expression a mix of worry and disappointment. She looked between the two of them, sensing the tension. "Is everything okay in here?" Michael shook his head, clearly agitated. "I'm fine, Mom. I need some space." Emma shot Jake a sympathetic glance, then moved to sit beside Michael, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sweetheart, I know this is hard, but maybe you could give him a chance." Michael let out a sigh, his frustration barely contained. "It's not that simple, Mom. He wasn't there for us. You were. You did everything alone. And now he just gets to walk in and act like he cares?" Jake's face tightened, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. "Michael, I didn't know about you. If I had, things would have been different." Michael's gaze was hard, unyielding. "But you didn't know. And now I'm the one who has to deal with that." Emma squeezed Michael's hand, her voice soft but firm. "I know it feels unfair, but he's here now, and he's trying. That has to count for something." Michael's expression softened slightly, but his voice was still guarded. "Maybe, but it doesn't just make everything better." Jake nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, and I'm not expecting it to. I just want a chance to be here, however you'll let me." Michael looked at him, his eyes searching, as if trying to determine whether his father's words held any real weight. After a moment, he nodded, though his face remained impassive. "Fine, but don't expect it to be easy." Jake offered a small, tentative smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The quiet truce between them lingered for the next few days, an unspoken agreement to coexist without addressing the wounds that lay just beneath the surface. But as Michael's health began to deteriorate, the stakes grew higher, the urgency in Jake's heart intensifying with every doctor's update. One afternoon, Jake and Emma were called into the hallway by Dr. Keller, the lead physician overseeing Michael's case. The doctor's face was somber, his eyes heavy with the burden of his message. "Mr. Dawson, Ms. Fields," Dr. Keller began, folding his hands. "Michael's condition has become more critical. We'll need to expedite the testing process to see if you're a viable match, Mr. Dawson. The sooner we know, the better." Jake felt a chill run through him, the weight of the doctor's words settling like a stone in his chest. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "Just tell me what I need to do." Emma's face was pale, her hand clutching her necklace as if for strength. Is there anything else we should know?" Dr. Keller's expression softened. "We're doing everything we can. but the window for a successful transplant is narrowing. Michael's body is under a great deal of stress, and time is not on our side. Jake's heart pounded, his voice trembling with determination. Then let's not waste another minute. I'll go through every test, anything you need. Dr. Keller nodded. We'll arrange the first round of testing immediately. As Jake and Emma returned to Michael's room, their faces heavy with the weight of the news, Michael looked up, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of their expressions. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Emma forced a smile, moving to sit beside him. "Nothing to worry about, honey. The doctors just need to do some additional tests. That's all." Michael's gaze flicked to Jake, his voice tense. "And you're part of those tests?" Jake nodded, his tone gentle but firm. "They need to see if I'm a match for the transplant." Michael looked away, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he muttered, "So now you're my hero, too?" Jake's heart sank, but he held his ground, his voice steady. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Michael. I just want to help you, whatever it takes." Michael's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his guarded exterior. "You say that now, but what about after? What happens when I'm not, when I don't need saving anymore?" Jake's voice trembled, his own fears bubbling to the surface. "I don't know what the future holds, Michael, but I promise, I'm not going anywhere." Michael looked at him, the anger in his eyes fading to something softer, almost hopeful. "We'll see." The tension eased slightly, leaving room for a fragile understanding between them. Jake knew it would be a long road, filled with moments of doubt and pain. But as he looked at his son, he knew one thing with certainty. He was willing to fight for whatever chance he had to be in Michael's life. It had been a long night, and Jake hadn't left the hospital. He sat in the dimly lit waiting room, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above, casting a pale glow on the sterile white walls. The clock ticked, each second echoing louder in the silence, reminding him of the time slipping by, of the years he could never get back. His mind drifted to his early days in business, the endless meetings, late nights, the deals he had put above everything else. Had he known then what he was missing, he would have done things differently. But that realization, that guilt, sat like a weight on his chest, pressing down with each beat of his heart. Couldn't sleep either. "Huh?" Jake looked up, surprised to see Emma standing in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to him, her eyes soft, empathetic. "Thanks," Jake muttered, taking a sip. The bitter warmth grounded him, even if only slightly. Emma took a seat beside him, glancing down the hallway where Michael's room was. "I don't think I've ever seen him this vulnerable," she murmured, almost to herself. "He's always been so strong, so independent. Even as a little boy, he never liked asking for help." Jake nodded, absorbing her words. "I can see that. He reminds me of someone I used to know. Someone stubborn." Emma gave him a small, wry smile. "Wonder where he got that from." They both chuckled softly, a quiet understanding settling between them. But soon, the laughter faded, and the silence returned, thicker this time, charged with the weight of unspoken regrets. "Emma," Jake began, his voice low, uncertain. "Why didn't you tell me? About Michael, I mean. I know you said you thought it was better, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd known." Emma sighed, looking away. Her fingers tapped gently on the coffee cup, a nervous habit he hadn't remembered. "At first, I was just scared," she admitted. "You had your career, your ambitions. I didn't want to hold you back, and maybe a part of me thought you wouldn't want us." Jake's throat tightened, regret filling every inch of him. "I would have wanted him, Emma. I would have wanted both of you." She looked at him, her gaze a mixture of apology and pain. "Maybe, but by the time I realized that, it was too late. Michael was already growing up, and I didn't want him to feel like a burden." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. He had been so focused on his life, his success, that he had missed out on the one thing that mattered most. "I wish I could change things," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Emma reached over, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "But you're here now. That counts for something." Jake nodded, though a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The years lost, the moments missed, they haunted him, like shadows lurking just out of reach. The quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps. Michael was standing in the doorway, looking at them both with a guarded expression. "Am I interrupting?" Emma straightened, a smile softening her features. "Not at all, sweetheart. We were just talking." Michael's gaze flicked to Jake, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Talking about me?" Jake cleared his throat, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Yeah, actually, just reminiscing a bit." Michael rolled his eyes, crossing his arms. "Right, because you know so much about my life." Jake felt the sting of his words, but tried to keep his tone steady. "I don't know as much as I'd like to, Michael, but I'd like to change that, if you'd let me." Michael looked at him, something flickering in his eyes. Hurt, maybe even a touch of curiosity, but it was quickly masked by his usual guardedness. "Whatever," he muttered, though he didn't leave the doorway. Jake seized the chance, his voice softer, more vulnerable. "You know, your mom just told me that you've always been strong, independent. I can see that. You don't let people in easily, do you?" Michael's gaze dropped, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his hoodie. "Why should I? People leave. They always do." The bitterness in his tone cut through Jake like a knife. He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to defend himself, to explain. But he knew that now wasn't the time. "I'm sorry, Michael," he said quietly. "I know I wasn't there for you, and I know I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Michael looked up, his expression softened, if only slightly. "You say that now, but how do I know you won't leave again?" Jake leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Because I'm your father, and that means something to me. I want to be here, Michael, whatever it takes." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of promises and doubts. Finally, Michael shrugged, though his voice was softer, almost vulnerable. "We'll see." Emma placed a gentle hand on Michael's shoulder, squeezing it slightly. "Maybe we can all figure this out together. It doesn't have to be perfect, just real." Jake nodded, looking between them, a small glimmer of hope flickering in his chest. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could bridge the gap that years of silence and separation had left. As the first light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, the three of them sat together in quiet companionship. And for that moment, it was enough. Days passed, and a fragile sense of routine began to settle between Jake and Michael. They had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, sharing brief conversations, exchanging guarded smiles, as if neither wanted to break the fragile truce they had managed to form. Emma would sit with them often, her presence grounding the two men, and as time wore on, their talks began to hold a little more ease, a little less tension. One afternoon, Jake entered Michael's room, noticing a sketchbook open on the bed. Michael was hunched over it, pencil in hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jake paused in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt, but also unable to hide his curiosity. "You're working on something?" Jake asked, his voice soft. Michael looked up, surprised, but then shrugged, glancing back at his sketch. "Just doodling. It helps pass the time." Jake stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The page was filled with intricate lines, a series of shapes that seemed to flow together, forming a scene both familiar and abstract. "That's incredible, Michael," Jake said, genuinely impressed. "You've got real talent." Michael's cheeks reddened slightly, though he tried to play it off. "It's nothing, really. Just something I mess around with." "Don't downplay it," Jake replied, his tone warm. "I mean it, you're talented. I could never do something like that." Michael glanced up at him, a hint of pride mixed with skepticism in his eyes. "Yeah? Well, thanks, I guess." Jake took a seat beside the bed, letting the moment settle. "So, have you thought about what you want to do? You know, when all this is behind you?" Michael hesitated, his gaze dropping to his sketchbook. "I don't know. I guess I never really thought about it. It's hard to think about the future when..." His voice trailed off, and he shrugged. "When you don't know what's gonna happen." Jake's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "I understand. But once you're better, maybe you could think about art school or something that lets you use that talent. You deserve a future, Michael. Michael didn't respond right away, but Jake could see the idea taking root in his mind. A faint spark of hope flickered in his eyes, as if the possibility of a life beyond the hospital walls was finally something he could imagine. Just then, Dr. Keller entered, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. He glanced between Jake and Michael, his eyes serious. "Mr. Dawson, Michael," he began, his tone measured. "I've got the results from the compatibility tests." Jake sat up straighter, his heart pounding. "And?" Dr. Keller looked at him, a brief smile crossing his face. "You're a match, Mr. Dawson. You're cleared to be the donor." A wave of relief washed over Jake, and he glanced at Michael, who was staring at the doctor, his eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like cautious hope. "So, it's happening?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Keller nodded, his expression warm. "Yes, we'll need to prepare you both, but everything's looking positive. With any luck, we should be able to proceed soon." Michael looked over at Jake, a faint smile breaking through his usual guarded expression. For the first time, there was a glimmer of real connection between them, a moment of shared relief, a glimpse of the life that lay beyond this ordeal. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't think." Jake reached over, squeezing his son's hand. "I told you, Michael. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, the room felt lighter, the weight of the past giving way to a new hope, a new beginning. They shared a smile, the unspoken understanding bridging the gap that had separated them for so long. But just as quickly as the hope had arrived, it was shattered. Dr. Keller's expression grew serious again, and he cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "There is one thing we need to discuss," he said carefully, his tone cautious. Jake's heart sank. "What is it?" Dr. Keller took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "While we're optimistic, this isn't without risks. For both of you, it's a complex surgery, and given Michael's condition, there's a chance of complications." Michael's face fell, his fingers tightening around the edge of the sketchbook. "So, you're saying it might not work?" Dr. Keller shook his head. "No, I'm saying that we need to be prepared for any outcome. The chances are good, but there's always a risk." Jake looked at Michael, his heart breaking at the fear he saw in his son's eyes. "Hey," he said softly, reaching out, "we'll get through this, whatever it takes." Michael's jaw clenched, and he looked away, his voice trembling. I just want this to be over. I want a life." Jake swallowed, the depth of Michael's words hitting him harder than he expected. "And you will have one," he promised. "You'll have a future. I'll make sure of it." But in that moment, the weight of the situation pressed down on them both, and Jake felt the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his resolve. They were on the brink of something, of hope, of healing, but the shadow of doubt lingered, a reminder that nothing was guaranteed. As Dr. Keller left, the room fell into silence once more, and Jake stayed close, sensing that words wouldn't be enough to bridge the fears between them. But as he looked at Michael, he realized that he didn't need words. He just needed to stay. The day before the surgery, the hospital was unusually quiet, the atmosphere thick with a tension that Jake could feel in his bones. He sat beside Michael's bed, flipping through an old magazine, though he wasn't reading a single word. Every so often, he'd glance up, watching as Michael scrolled through his phone, the faint glow reflecting off his face. "You nervous?" Jake finally asked, breaking the silence. Michael looked up, his expression guarded but honest. "Yeah, a little." Jake nodded, feeling a pang of guilt and helplessness. "Me too," he admitted softly. They exchanged a brief, understanding glance, neither saying more, both lost in their own thoughts. Just then, a knock at the door startled them both. It was Dr. Keller, clipboard in hand, his face etched with concern. "Good evening, gentlemen," he greeted, his voice carrying an unusual heaviness. Jake's pulse quickened. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Keller hesitated, glancing between them. "We ran a few more pre-surgery tests this afternoon, and we found something unexpected in Michael's blood work," Michael's face drained of color. What does that mean? Dr. Keller took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. It seems there's an anomaly in your liver enzymes, Michael. It's a rare condition that complicates things. Your body may have a harder time accepting a transplant, even from a family donor. Jake's heart dropped, his voice barely a whisper. Are you saying he can't have the surgery? Dr. Keller shook his head. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it means the risks are higher. Much higher than we initially anticipated. Michael's hands tightened around the edge of his blanket, his knuckles turning white. So what now? His voice was strained, barely holding back the frustration and fear that simmered beneath the surface. Dr. Keller's expression softened. There are ways to mitigate the risks, but it will require more intense monitoring, both during and after the surgery. We'll need to prepare for a longer recovery period, and there's still no guarantee. Jake looked at Michael, his heart breaking at the fear in his son's eyes. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. We'll do whatever it takes. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. Michael's gaze met his, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. But what if it doesn't work? What if I don't make it? Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He reached over, gripping Michael's hand. Then I'll still be right here, every step of the way. Michael looked away, swallowing hard. I didn't think it would be this complicated. I thought it was supposed to be easier. Jake's heart twisted with regret, his voice soft. I'm sorry, Michael. I wish I could make it easier. Dr. Keller nodded sympathetically. I know this is difficult to hear, but we'll do everything in our power to make this as safe as possible. You've come this far, Michael. Don't lose hope now. Michael let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping. I'll try. Dr. Keller gave a reassuring nod. That's all anyone can ask for. He looked to Jake, his gaze steady. I'll give you both some time. We'll proceed as planned tomorrow, but I wanted you to be aware of the added risks. After Dr. Keller left, silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Jake looked at Michael, his son's face a mixture of fear and determination. He wished he could take away the uncertainty, the fear, but all he could offer was his presence. Michael's voice broke the silence, barely more than a whisper. Do you think we'll ever get past this? Like, have a normal life? Jake felt his chest tighten. I don't know, Michael, but if we get through this, I promise, we'll figure it out together. Whatever it takes. Michael looked at him, his gaze filled with a vulnerability Jake had rarely seen. I want that. I don't want to feel like this forever. Jake swallowed, his voice thick with emotion. Then hold on. For both of us. They sat together, the silence stretching out, each moment heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. For the first time, Jake felt the fragility of everything he'd come to care about in the past few weeks. It terrified him, but it also solidified his resolve. He wouldn't let go. Not now, not ever. The hours passed in agonizing slowness. Jake sat in the waiting room, his hands clenched into fists, his gaze fixed on the door that led to the operating room. Every so often, nurses would walk by, giving him polite nods, but no one brought any news. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to mock him, each second stretching longer than the last. Emma sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes red from sleepless nights and held back tears. She leaned over, placing a hand on Jake's arm. He's strong, Jake. Stronger than either of us realized. Jake managed a small nod, but his chest felt tight, like a weight pressing down on his ribs. I know he is, but this... He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can bear it, Emma. Waiting here, not knowing. Emma squeezed his arm, her own voice filled with pain. We've done everything we can. Now, we just have to have faith. Just as she said this, the doors to the operating room opened, and Dr. Keller stepped out, his surgical mask pulled down, his face weary but calm. Jake jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. Doctor, is he? Dr. Keller's face broke into a small, reassuring smile. He made it through the surgery. Everything went as smoothly as we could have hoped. Jake felt the weight lift off his chest, a surge of relief flooding him. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his hands shaking slightly. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Keller nodded, his tone gentle. He's resting now. The recovery process will be challenging, but Michael has a good chance at a full recovery. Jake's gaze softened, a wave of gratitude washing over him. Can I see him? Dr. Keller gestured down the hall. Just for a moment. He's still coming out of the anesthesia, so he may be a bit groggy. Jake nodded, glancing back at Emma, who offered him a gentle smile of encouragement. Go ahead. He needs you. Jake walked down the sterile hallway, each step bringing him closer to the room where Michael lay. When he finally stepped inside, he felt a pang of emotion that nearly brought him to his knees. Michael lay in the bed, his face pale, but there was a peacefulness about him, a sense of calm that Jake hadn't seen before. He moved to the side of the bed, his hand reaching out to gently brush Michael's hair back. At that moment, Michael's eyes fluttered open, his gaze hazy but focused on Jake. Dad? His voice was a whisper, filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Jake's chest tightened, and he felt his own tears welling up. Yeah, I'm here. And you did it. You made it through. Michael gave a weak smile, his fingers moving slightly as if trying to reach out. Jake took his hand, holding it gently, feeling the warmth, the life that pulsed through his son's fingers. I thought maybe I wouldn't make it, Michael murmured, his voice thick with the remnants of anesthesia. But I'm still here. Jake nodded, his voice choked with emotion. You are. And I'm so proud of you, Michael. You've shown more strength than I ever thought possible. Michael's gaze softened, and he squeezed Jake's hand, his expression filled with a quiet, unspoken gratitude. Thanks for being here, for not giving up on me. Jake felt a tear slide down his cheek, but he didn't bother wiping it away. I would never give up on you. You're my son, and nothing will ever change that. They sat together in silence, the weight of their journey finally giving way to a sense of peace, of hope. After a few minutes, Emma stepped into the room, her face lighting up at the sight of them together. How are you feeling, sweetheart? She asked, moving to the other side of the bed and brushing her fingers over Michael's forehead. Tired, Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. But happy. Emma smiled, her eyes shining. That's all that matters. You're here with us, and that's everything. As the evening wore on, Jake stayed by Michael's side, listening to him talk about the future with a newfound excitement, a life that he now had the chance to live fully. They spoke of art school, travel plans, and all the things Michael wanted to do. The dreams that no longer felt like distant fantasies but real possibilities. At one point, Michael looked at Jake, his eyes filled with sincerity. You know, I was mad at you for not being there all those years. But now, I don't want to waste any more time being angry. Jake's throat tightened, and he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I understand, Michael, and I promise, I'll be here for every moment from now on. They shared a smile, a silent understanding passing between them, a bond that no amount of lost time could ever break. As the first rays of morning light seeped through the window, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The journey had been hard, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but it had led him to this moment, a future with his son. And for the first time, they were truly together, ready to face whatever came next, side by side. At the heart of this story is a powerful reminder. Family and love can be tested but also profoundly redeemed. Jake's journey with Michael reminds us of the importance of showing up when it truly matters, even if we weren't there from the start. Sometimes life gives us second chances, but they're rarely easy, often requiring courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to face the mistakes of the past. For Michael, healing wasn't just about the surgery. It was about finally having the father he had always missed. And for Jake, his transformation was in learning that true success doesn't lie in wealth or status, but in the relationships we build and the moments we cherish. Reflecting on this, ask yourself, who in your life needs you to show up today? Perhaps it's someone you've been distant from, or maybe someone you've unintentionally hurt. Redemption and forgiveness are two of the most powerful acts of love we can offer each other. Let's strive to be present, to give love a chance, and to mend the wounds we've left untended. Don't forget to subscribe to stay connected with more stories like this, and share your thoughts on second chances and family in the comments below.